What is going on, guys? It's Bucky with Triways. Welcome back to the channel. So in this video, I'm gonna give a full tutorial and the best tips and information I can to help you guys catch redfish in the early springtime. I'm gonna be talking about understanding redfish, their eating habits, what's changing here in the springtime, the best locations, where to target these fish, understanding the best lures to throw, understanding jigging techniques, and really ultimately the best tackle and gear to use. So I hope this video helps you guys. If you're not already subscribed to Triways, I'd appreciate it if you hit that button, and let's go ahead and get into this video. All right, so the first part that we're going to talk about is fun facts on redfish and understanding what's changing here in the springtime. So ultimately during the wintertime, the redfish will move out to deeper water, and they're really not going to be located in a lot of your inlets and some of your creeks where you're fishing them in the spring and summertime. Ultimately, when you have this warmer weather that starts to pick up in the springtime, it obviously increases the water temperature. And what that does is it brings the reds into a lot of these local inlets, some of the flats, different oyster beds, different creeks, and ultimately more of the inshore fishing for these reds. During these winter months, the water temperature, of course, is much cooler, which lowers the redfish's metabolism and gets them a lot more lethargic. So of course, they're not as aggressive. They're not much on the hunt as they would be, of course, in the spring and summertime. When we have the air temperatures that start to warm up, it obviously then brings up the water temperatures. This increases the metabolism in these fish and gets them a lot more aggressive. They start to turn into hunters. I like to call them sleepers in the wintertime. They go to deeper water, into the mud, try to absorb some of that heat. And then in springtime here, they start to come up into more shallow water, into these inlets, and start getting more aggressive. And their biggest reason why is because they're looking for food and they're looking for the bait. Regardless of different eating habits of redfish, they're ultimately really bottom feeders. They have a bigger lower jaw and they will almost eat anything, almost kind of like a catfish. They like to come into these local inshore inlets, and they will eat crabs, crustaceans, snails, bait fish, different type of lures, plastic, live bait. And their obviously biggest motive right now is looking for food. They want to feel comfortable. Redfish are known to be around structure, and oyster beds are a great reason why. So understanding what's changing here in their habitat, the water temperatures are increasing. You start to have a lot more of the microorganisms that are coming up into a lot of these habitats and the inshore inlets that cause these redfish to come in and start hunting for bait. So there are so many different spots and locations that redfish are at, definitely inshore here in the early springtime. But some of the best areas that I would recommend starting is number one, and ultimately my favorite spot to fish, is oyster beds. You also have the grass flats, you have shallows, you have structure, different types of beds or different points, specifically kind of on different islands. And understanding each one of these locations is very critical in targeting redfish. Here in the springtime, a lot of these reds like to school up and they are hunting for bait together. So ultimately what I've said in the past is if you can catch 1 or 2 redfish, you can possibly catch 5 or 10 in a day, because once you find them, a lot of times they're going to be schooled up. Now, of course, that's easier said than done, but understanding your locations, what you're looking for in regards to moving water, different tides, is the first start on locating these reds. Now in warmer months, when it becomes later spring into summertime, a lot of these reds will start to spread out individually on their own when they're starting to look for different types of bait and food. But again, in springtime, if you can find 1 or 2 fish, 3 or 4, you're getting bites, they're probably going to be schooled up, which is going to be the best start. So the first location I want to talk about is oyster beds, which are probably my favorite location to target redfish, especially more inshore here in Virginia Beach. The reason I love oyster beds so much is because it's its own ecosystem. You have so many different type of microorganisms that live in these oyster beds that ultimately, of course, bring the redfish in and looking for bait in these oyster beds. Oyster beds house so many different types of baits with crustaceans, crabs, snails, and all the other small bait fish that come in here and feed. And this ultimately brings in a ton of big redfish, and I've caught a lot of redfish at a low tide in oyster beds in possibly 6 to 10 inches of water. So oyster beds is probably my #1 location for redfish here in springtime. Next location we're going to talk about is grass beds and the flats. For inshore, this really depends on how much water movement and what type of tides you have. Grass beds house a ton of small bait fish that of course brings these reds up and gets them aggressive, gets them to start biting. I love grass and flat beds, typically at a low tide up to a high tide, because you have water that's moving in. The redfish are out in deeper water. Once you have that water moving and understanding that those bait are coming up in those grass beds, but also you will see reds come up in the shallows and the flats. You see a lot of drone footage probably on YouTube of schools of red that are feeding and biting in 6 to 10 inches of water. So understanding, of course, water movement is very important, but grass flats and shallows are a great spot also in springtime. The next location we're going to talk about is structure, and this is very important because structure is where these redfish feel the most comfortable. Some of the best examples of structure for inshore inlets would be docks, different type of pylons, bridges, or it could be a different type of structure under the water that house a lot of these redfish, because ultimately you have a lot of bait fish and different type of microorganisms that are around this structure. Water movement is very important around this structure. Bringing bait in and out houses a lot of these redfish. So again, structure is a great start. The next location we're going to talk about is points on different islands. So in local inshore inlets, like Virginia Beach here and all across the East Coast, you have so many different types of islands that make up a lot of these inlets. Of course, with high and low tides, these can sometimes change. But one of my favorite spots to target reds, especially here in the springtime, is on the points of these islands. And the reason why is because when you have water movement coming from low tide to high tide or vice versa, you can have different depths on both sides of the points on these islands. And what this ultimately does is brings a lot of different type of bait around both sides of the island. So on one, let's say for example, on the south point of an island, you could have a 5 to 10 foot drop that a lot of these reds are sitting, where the bait fish are coming around those points and these reds are striking on. Now on the other end, on the north end, you could have a foot or two of water, and during a low tide or a high tide, the bait are schooled up on the point that again would bring those fish on the opposite side of the island, striking on that side as well. So island points are great. Understanding the different depth measurements on both sides or different locations on the island is very important. Water movement is huge on these islands because it's going to bring bait in and out, and understanding what depths these redfish are on these points and islands is critical. The last location I'm going to talk about is small coves or mouths of small creeks here in local inlets. The reason why I like fishing and targeting redfish in these locations is because this water is not impacted by a lot of the tides and current and moving water. Ultimately, what that does, it keeps a more muddy bottom. And the reason why this is important is because that muddy bottom attracts more heat that allows the redfish to soak up that warmth, that ultimately increases their metabolism and gets these fish more aggressive. When the redfish are sitting in a lot of these shallow waters on this mud attracting this heat, gets them a lot more aggressive. But the other part that's important is you have a lot of bait fish that are moving in and out of these creeks and different mouths of these coves. So once I see a lot of water moving on the outside of some of these creeks, these coves, I love to throw and cast up in some of these mouths and these little creeks, because ultimately you have a lot of redfish that can be schooled up in there, tracking the heat, and it's where a lot of bait fish are coming in and out from a lot of those different tides. All right, so the next part of this video we're going to talk about is understanding the best lures to throw for redfish here in early springtime. Now the reds in springtime can be very aggressive, but at the same time they can also be sluggish. Their metabolism is a lot of times a lot lower, so they're not as aggressive as the summertime, when you can throw almost anything out there and they're biting. So they can sometimes be spooked very easily. So with that being said, understanding jigging techniques is very important. In the springtime, I do a lot more, probably of a slower reel in, less twitches and jigs. It's a lot of kind of bottom bouncing. But also on the other end, it's very important to understand to use probably a smaller lure. I like to use anywhere from a 3 to 4 inch lure at the biggest. Again, just because I don't want to present anything too big out there with a lot of quick jigs like I would probably in the summertime to spook a lot of these reds. All right, with that being said, the first lure we're going to talk about is artificial shrimps. And I wish I could throw live shrimps, which reds love here, but unfortunately in the spring, early springtime, we do not have any live shrimp that we can find anywhere at the local bait shops. So I like throwing artificial shrimps, and the reason why is because reds, of course, love shrimps. They are dialed in, and kind of like the reds in the wintertime, These shrimp are not in a lot of these local inlets. So these shrimp start coming in the warmer weather. A lot of the local inlets, the flats, grass beds, around the oyster beds, which cause these redfish to get a lot more aggressive. So I like throwing a lot of different types of shrimp. This specifically is a 3.5 inch voodoo shrimp. That's got actually a 1/4 ounce jig head on it. And then I also throw a lot of times these 3.5 inch shrimps, the chartreuse gulps. These have been a big bait for me that I've used for years. I like throwing these a lot of times on popping corks in shallow water inshore. I've had a lot of luck. There's a lot of different types, of course, of different artificial and fake shrimps that you guys can use. But shrimps is a big go-to on a great lure to use for reds in springtime. The second lure I'm going to talk about, and is probably my favorite and the most popular really on the East Coast, is Paddletails. Now, there are a million different types of Paddletails. One of my favorites is Z-Man. They make a great Paddletail. I'm also used Saltwater Assassin really a lot. This has been a go-to of mine. And no, I'm not sponsored by these guys, but if you guys want to shout me out, I'd appreciate it. And Paddletails are great. And the reason I like using Paddletails in the springtime is I can cover a lot of water using these. I personally think Paddletails are the best overall profile lure for redfish. I would recommend using definitely a lot more of a natural color, make this look as real as possible, and understanding jigging techniques using these Paddletails is very important. In the summertime, I'm doing a lot more quicker retrieval, doing a lot more quicker jigs, and I'm not really letting that lure sit too long. And the springtime is a little different. I'm retrieving a lot slower. I'm doing some twitches, but it's really almost a lot more kind of bottom fishing, letting that jig and that lure rest for a little bit. And then I'm retrieving, I'm doing some jigs. But again, your redfish are not as aggressive as they are in the summertime. So Paddletails are great. Like I said, you can cover a lot of water and a lot of different structure, flats, grass beds, oyster beds. And I would highly recommend, there's so many different types. But again, I'd probably recommend more of a natural color, 3 to 4 inches tops. It's going to guarantee you to catch some big reds. The next lure that I'm going to talk about is jerk shads. These are great lures. There's one, for example. These are great lures to use, which I probably use more in the early time to target redfish. This I'm going to work a lot slower even than a paddletail. The reason why is the profile here on a jerk shad, I like to retrieve a lot slower. This I'm really trying to use really just to locate the fish. So if I'm going out early mornings and I'm trying to find where these schools are at, I'm probably going to start with a jerk shad, and I'm doing a very, very, very slow retrieval and some small jigs and twitches of the rod. The reason why is this is a little bigger profile than a paddletail, for example, but these jerk shads are great to use, like I said, for targeting and trying to find these redfish in the early mornings. And this is like really a straight bottom bouncer for me. I'm throwing this thing up probably in shallow water or deeper water with a very, very slow retrieval and a couple twitches, but I'm bouncing this thing and I'm really letting this sit to see where these redfish are at. Once I identify and locate a lot of the reds, I'll typically go over to, again, a shrimp or a paddletail like I just talked about. But jerk shads are great to use on trying to locate fish. I probably wouldn't use this all day. It depends, maybe these reds want it. But I would definitely recommend these early mornings, trying to find where these reds are at with a much slower jig and a couple small twitches probably compared to a paddletail. All right, the next lure I'm going to talk about is different types of twitch baits. Now, these are great to use primarily probably later in the day after you've targeted and started catching these fish. I would not recommend using these probably first thing in the morning when you're trying to find where these fish are at, but I really like using twitch baits. Once I've already started catching some reds, you know where they're at, you know they're biting, because it's a lot more probably challenging in getting these reds to bite in the springtime. However, twitch baits are great lures to use. This specifically is the Mirror Miradyne twitch bait, and this is actually a rattle trap, which is just a different type of twitch bait. But I like using these later in the day. Once I've probably already caught some reds, I've targeted them. It can be a little more challenging than a soft plastic, but the way that I retrieve these is twitch, twitch, pause. And these are kind of like what we were taught when we were bass fishing, right? I don't want to drag this through the water too much. I want to make this look as real as possible. So with twitch baits, I actually kind of keep a little slack in my line that allows this kind of to float through the water, if you will. And then when I pause it, it sinks down. When you have a tight line, you're kind of really just dragging your lure through the water and it doesn't look as real. So keep a little slack in the line, do some twitches, and it's important to let this thing drop, which on that drop a lot of times for me is when those redfish strike. Rattle traps, again, are great options. Different type of twitch baits are great for reds springtime. All right, and the last lure that I'm going to talk about, or I should say bait, is using cut bait or live bait, which I use a lot of times here in the early springtime. One of my favorite go-tos is finger mullet. If we can get live finger mullet's a great choice. A lot of the options that we have in the springtime is frozen, but cut bait is big, of course, because it gives off that natural scent. But these fish, these reds, are looking for any type of microorganisms in these inshore inlets, and cut bait gives a lot of course, different smells out in that water that attracts the reds in. If you can find live shrimp, I would highly recommend. That's a great go-to. Some reds like squid cut bait. There's a lot of different options. Some people even use fiddler crabs. So again, there's a lot of different types of plastics that you can use, but in regards to actual live bait or cut bait, is also just always a great choice for redfish here in springtime. All right, and the last part of this video I'm going to talk about is knowing the best gear and tackle to use to target redfish here in the springtime. My ultimate probably go-to rod and reel for redfish here in the springtime, or just in general for some of these inshore reds, is more of a medium heavy fast action rod. I like using probably a 7-foot, and I like to use anywhere from probably a 3,000 to 4,000 series reel, kind of a 5 to 6 bearing ratio. And in regards to line, probably for reds inshore, I like using braided line. Most importantly, I always use braid on all my inshore rods and reels, but I like using anywhere from probably a 15 to 20 pound test. I know some people like using super light tackle, maybe in a 6.5 light action rod with like a 2000 series reel, like 12-pound braid test. That's fun sometime. I might use that for trout. But in regards to reds, I would probably recommend the best option is a 7-foot, 3,000 to 4,000 series, nothing probably any bigger than that, and probably a 15 to 20 pound braided line. And this is going to be probably your best option in regards to gear and tackle targeting reds in the early springtime. All right, guys, I hope this video gave you as much tips and information as possible on targeting and catching redfish here in the early springtime. This truly is one of my favorite times of the year, especially when we've been cooped up all winter long. The air and water temperatures start to shift, brings those reds in, and the bite really starts to take off. So it really is a great time of the year. I truly appreciate you guys watching. Again, if you're not subscribed to Try Waves, I'd appreciate it if you hit that button. 2023 is going to be a great year. I've already got so much planned. Looking forward to getting back out here in the bay and the ocean here soon. I'm going to be releasing a lot of great content. So I look forward to you guys following along and keeping up to date on my videos and everything on the channel. So again, I appreciate you guys watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys on the water.